Hi, everybody. Welcome to video 2.1 for our new unit, Economic Indicators and Business Cycles. We're going to be talking about GDP, inflation, unemployment, and happiness, actually. So let's get into it. Concept 2.1 is circular flow in GDP. Remember, as I'm going through this, try to get a few notes down so that you have something to underline or emphasize when we go over it again in class the next day. So, concept 2.1. Two concepts here, circular flow and GDP. Let's get to it. Remember, whenever we're looking at our economy as a whole, we're trying to grow it and improve it, make it better and better. Because when your economy is growing, it means more people have jobs. It means those jobs are paying a better wage. And that means more people have access to goods and services, which means that more people satisfy their utilities, their needs, and their wants. And so it's this incredible cycle that if we continue to grow and get better and better at this, then we'll continue to better solve the problem of scarcity, meeting as many needs and wants as possible with the same amount of scarce resources. That's really the key here. But whenever I'm trying to measure growth of something, I have to really try to understand, where are we at? Are we actually growing? Are we doing a good job? And so we try to measure the health of our economy. So I use this with a couple of data points that are really, really important to economists, and you actually probably hear them talked about a lot. Maybe you know what they are, maybe you have some idea of what they are. But really, whenever you see a news report, whether it's on your phone or on TV or on the radio, if you listen to that still, whenever you see a report, normally they're talking about GDP or inflation or the unemployment rate. And so we're really going to dive deeply into those this unit in order to better understand what the health of our economy is and how to predict changes to those health indicators in the future. So let's get into it. The first thing is called the circular flow diagram. Circular flow diagram actually just shows us the flow of income and the flow of wages and the flow of money or expenditures versus the flow of goods and services and resources. So it's predicated on the fact that we have two markets. We have a resource or factor market where labor is bought and sold and resources are bought and sold, normally by businesses. And we have a product market where goods are bought and sold. So if you want to screenshot it here, you can, but I think it's easier just to draw it and explain it as I draw. So let's get into it. Okay, so we have two main entities. Entity one is our resource market. In the resource market, it's also known as the factor market, resource market or factor market. Resources are bought and sold, right? So it's that marketplace. So think of it as like monster.com for employment, right? You want a job, you put your resume on monster.com, and then somebody offers you a job. It's that kind of marketplace. That's the resource or factor market. Then down here, across from it, we have our other market, and this is our product market. We call it product market, but it's really goods and services. And this is where, we go all of the time. It's Amazon, it's Walmart, it's Sears. That doesn't exist anymore. It's any website where you buy goods and services. Anywhere that market exists, that is called the product market. So far, so good. Resources are bought in one market, products are bought in another market. Now we have two central players here. The first central player are people like you and me. So I'll put another box over here on the side. We call these households. But households, you can just think of them as consumers, right? People like you and me, and also people who sell resources, which we'll talk about here in a second. And then on the other side, we have businesses, often referred to as firms. So I'll just say firms. Writing with a mouse is hard. There we go. So we got our firms, households, and firms. Okay. Important to note, households, I'm just going to put this below it. Households own the resources, right? I think the best way to think of that is you and I own our own labor. It's your labor. You get to decide who you want to sell that labor to. I sold my labor to CVCA through the resource market, but you can sell your labor to anybody else. In the same sense, people, it's individuals that own land, it's individuals that own capital, it's individuals that own all of the different resources, entrepreneurial ability that are bought and sold in order to produce goods, right? So we own those. And then firms, we know, produce. So firms need those resources and they use those resources to produce goods and services that we then consume. Okay? So the first flow that we need to look at is the flow from the households to the resource market. What do households bring to the resource market? What are you selling at the resource market? Well, you're selling resources. Remember, households own all the resources. We own our own labor. So we bring resources to the resource market. Now, why would we sell our resources? What's the point? What do we get in return for the resources we are selling? Of course, we get money, right? We get income, we get rents, we get wages, we get money in return for the resources that we sell. So we take it in there, we sell it to who we want to, we get money in return. Well, who's giving you that money? Well, of course, it's the firms. Firms are the ones that need resources. So firms bring their money to the resource market, right? What do firms get in return for the money that they bring to the resource market? They get resources. Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability is purchased in the resource market. That's the flow. Households take their resources to the resource market, get money in return. Firms take money to the resource market, they get resources in return. And this is how money goes from firms to households and how resources go from households to firms. Okay. So now the firms take those resources and what do they do with it? Well, we put it right down here. They produce goods and services. So we draw another arrow. They take those goods and services, goods. I'm just going to put goods and services. They take those to the product market. Why? Because they want to sell those goods and services. When they sell the goods and services that they have produced, what do they get in return? You got it. Money. We call it revenue, but they get money in return, right? So they take their goods to the product market. They get money or income from that product market, from selling those goods. They then take that money and go to the resource market, get more resources so that they can continue to produce. See the flow here? Now these goods are produced. Who wants those goods? Who uses those goods to satisfy their utility? Households. So those goods are going to be purchased by the households in the product market, right? You're going to go on Amazon and you're going to buy yourself some new shoes. Those goods are being purchased. How do you get those goods? You get those goods with money, right? So the flow is money. So households bring money to the resource or the product market, and as a result are able to purchase goods and services. And this is the flow, right? So let's take it from the resource market. Households take resources to the resource market. They get money in return. When they get that money, they then go to the product market with that money and they get goods and services in return, maximizing their utility. So they use resources, the sale of resources, to get the money needed to maximize their utility, better solving the problem of scarcity. We jump over here. What's going on with firms? Well, firms bought those resources in the resource market with money. What do they do with those resources? They produce goods and services, which they then take to the product market and they get income in return. So they utilize the purchase of resources to produce so that they can then sell those goods and reap maximum profit, not utility, but profit. As a result of this circular flow, we will find that income equals expenditures. Income equals expenditures. So all the money that comes in as income for households is going to be equal to the income of expenditures in the product market. All the money that comes in as income to the firms is going to be equal to the expenditures in the resource market. That's in a perfect flow. However, we have leakage all over the place. There's all kinds of leakage. Households decide to save some of their money. That's leakage. They didn't go and buy goods and services. They saved. It leaks out of the economy. It harms our economy when people save money. True story, right? Firms decide to make maximum profit, right? But they have to pay taxes on that. Yikes. So that's leakage. It's money that could be going back into the resource market that instead is being filtered out by the government, right? So that is a circular flow in a perfect world. Households would sell resources, get money, take the money, and go get goods. Businesses would sell goods, get money, take the money, and go get more resources, and on and on and on the flow goes. Okay, let's keep going. Maybe. There we go. Okay, so we have three main goals of macroeconomic policy. Goal number one is we want to promote economic growth. We talked about that already. When you grow, you better solve the problem of scarcity. The second is we want to keep people in their jobs, keep unemployment low. When you keep unemployment low, it means more people have jobs, which means more people have income, so then go to the product market and satisfy their utility. And then third, we want to keep prices stable. Price inflation actually has the potential to completely destroy an economy because now the income I made is worth less money than it was before. So I can buy fewer goods and services. So we try to keep these three things in balance. And this is exactly what we're trying to do right now in our economy. So let's focus on promoting economic growth first. Measuring goal one. How do we measure our progress on this goal for a macroeconomic policy? Okay, so we do this through an indicator called GDP, which is commonly known. Most people have heard of this before. It's gross domestic product, but it is the number one measure of economic success and health, right? It's like the beats per minute or the blood pressure for the health of a human being. If GDP is going down, it's heart failure for a nation. It's bad, 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 bad. So GDP, there's a definition: value of final goods and services produced within the borders of a country during a specific amount of time, right? So it's gross, meaning all, domestic, meaning within our country, product, meaning it's about what we produce. And if you think about it, when a business produces something, that means they have to hire labor to produce it, which means that income is flowing and we're back in that circular flow we just talked about. And then during the specific amount of time, that makes it measurable for us. So we can actually measure it from year to year, quarter to quarter, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So that's gross domestic product. It's production within the borders of our nation, and it's measurable. So if I produce something outside of the borders of my nation, it doesn't count as GDP, right? Even if I sell it in the United States, if it's produced outside of the US, it doesn't count because the circular flow is happening in a different nation. I produced it over there. The people getting money are not Americans. That means somebody else is getting that income and going to their product market, which is then making profit for their business, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So it has to be produced within the borders of a nation. All right, let's keep going. What is not included in GDP? What's not included is a lot of things. Intermediate goods are not included. So if I buy this lumber, for example, because I'm going to build a house, well, I don't count GDP when I buy the lumber. It's not counted towards GDP. Even though people are making money and people are working in the lumber yard, I count it when I sell the house, not when I make the lumber, but I sell the house. Because if I counted it in both of those stages, I would count it twice. The lumber would be counted at the initial stage when I bought it, and the lumber would be counted again as a part of the value of the house. So we only measure final goods, not intermediate goods. Okay? Difference between a final and intermediate good. Final good is sold to a consumer or a business who's going to use it. An intermediate good is sold as an input that's going to be used by a business to produce something else. Used goods don't count. If it's used, it was counted in a previous year. So you sell a bunch of used cars. That's great. Yes, people make money from that. But I want to double count those cars. They were counted back in 1983 when that car was built. I don't want to count it again in 2020. Illegal activity is not counted. Obviously, we don't count illegal activity. One of the big pushes for the legalization of marijuana is we would see a dramatic increase in GDP. So, if that's important to you, I guess that's all you need to know. All right, then non-market goods. So if it's not bought and sold, if it's produced for personal use, it's not counted as production. Even though you spent time and effort in there, it wasn't sold in our system as a resource or as a product, so it's not going to be counted. So when your grandma bakes you a pie, delicious, yes. Hard work, yes. Labor, yes. Combined inputs, yes. But not sold in the market. I hope your grandma's not selling you pies. I hope you get them for free. All right, just a couple of indicators here, just fun with GDP. The United States, it's actually a little bit higher than this, but $19.4 trillion is the GDP, gross domestic product, which is really good. It's really, really high. And you can think of that as like a salary, right? The United States has a really, really high salary. They're the best paid nation in the world. But when we correct for parity, meaning the purchasing power of those dollars, China actually is better than us, and the European Union. Both of them balance the amount of money that you make versus how much it costs for the goods and services. Well, the cost of goods and services in the United States is higher, so as a result, the GDP actually goes further in China and the EU, although the United States is doing pretty well. This is just fun. This is each state's GDP, similar to countries in the world. So here in Ohio, we have the same GDP as Switzerland. New York has the same GDP as Canada. What else? We got Texas is the same GDP as Brazil. Or California has the same GDP as France. I think this is fun, but it doesn't help us at all. Let's keep moving. We use GDP and measure it over time. And when we're comparing GDP from year to year, we can get percent growth. And so that helps us understand how we are doing today versus how we were doing yesterday. Just looking at the number isn't super helpful. What we're asking is, are we getting better than we were before? And so you can see here, generally, US economic growth is positive, 3 to 4% of most years. But here in 2008 to 2020, notice it shrunk by 4%. And we actually have new data, or I can draw it on here. We have new data where this is falling about 5%. We'll see, it was just for one quarter, but the dip is even actually worse than what it is on this graph or what it was in 2008. All right, so how do we measure this? We use current GDP versus previous GDP. It's just percent growth. Whenever you're measuring the growth of something, you use this same equation. So if I was measuring the growth in my height, right, and I was 60 inches and now I'm 65 inches, I would plug that into this equation and see what my percentage growth is. It's the same equation. We'll use it for a lot of different things. In fact, we use it for the growth in price, inflation, in this same unit. And it's simply current minus previous divided by previous. You just got to memorize that. Current minus previous divided by previous. So what I am now versus what I was divided by what I was. So let's plug these numbers in and see if you can figure it out. If my current GDP is $120, then I put 120 right here. My previous was 100. I put 100 right here. And then my previous was 100. And I solved 120 minus 100 divided by 100 is going to give me 0.2, right? 0.2. Now I multiply it by 100 to make that in a percentage, or you can just remember that you need to move this over 2 spots to give it 20. And so that is a 20% growth in GDP. Okay, not so bad. Current minus previous divided by previous. Let's try the next one. Okay, if my current is 1300, I put that right here. My previous is 1,000. I put that right here. And then I put that down here as well, previous. It's going to be 1,300 minus 1,000, or 300, divided by 1,000, which is going to give me 0.3. And then I multiply that by 100, and that gives me 30%. Okay, let's try the last one. Last one, my current is 5.7. Whoa, 5. Tried to do that with one hand. 5.7. My previous was 4.3. And so I plug that into 2 spots. So that is going to be 5.7 minus 4.3, or 1.4. Let me plug this into my calculator here. 1.4 divided by 4.3. 1.4 divided by 4.3. That gives me 0.325. I multiply that by 100, and I have 32.5% is my change in GDP. That's your first equation. You just got to memorize that. Percent growth, current minus previous divided by previous. Let's keep going. Here you can see the percentage of growth. You see that Iraq actually has dramatic percentage growth. And the United States has very little. You can think of this as like kind of foraging in the jungle. Whoever is in the lead has to cut through all the bush with their machetes, right? So it takes a lot more time to innovate and have economic growth. But those that are trailing way, way behind, they can just run down the trail very quickly. And so you can see dramatic gains in growth in a very short amount of time for nations that are developing. Okay. We saw China. China had a 10% growth curve for a very long time, but that started to slow down. But all of this doesn't actually tell us standard of living, right? GDP is nice, but GDP doesn't tell us the quality of life in a country. And so what we do is we take this one step further. And in order to try and identify at least some kind of GDP standard of living, we have to take that GDP number and we divide it by the population. So GDP divided by population gives us GDP per capita. When we take GDP or real GDP, we'll talk about that difference soon. But when we take GDP and we divide it by the population, it gives us kind of a salary, right? Like an average salary for the entire country. If we took all of the money we made and we split it up evenly between the entire population, this is about what it's like to live in this country versus another country. You live like you make 50,000 a year versus 10,000 a year in another country. Now, it's not apples to apples. And of course, we have income inequality. Not everybody gets paid the same, but at least it is a marker that says, hey, sure, you have a lot of GDP, but maybe that GDP is because you have a giant population and everybody's really broke, right? Or sure, you have a low GDP, but your population is really low. So the quality of life is actually quite high, right? So that matters. That nuance matters. We actually call this growth in GDP per capita modern economic growth, or MEG for short. So before the 1700s, for the history of the world, in order to have growth in GDP per capita, in order to have growth in GDP in general, it had to happen because we had a higher population. And this made sense, right? People used to die very quickly, very early. But when we started to have medical innovations, people stuck around, right? So as populations grew, we had increased production because we have more people to build things, right? However, the standard of living was very stagnant because you were dividing that profit, that growing profit is being divided by a growing population. And so it's a very stagnant kind of standard of living. In other words, our GDP per capita is unchanged because both GDP and population are changing at the same rate. However, with the Industrial Revolution that took place, that modern technology created an incredible growth in productivity, and productivity or GDP outpaced the population. In other words, GDP per capita grew, increased. And whenever we see GDP per capita rising, we call that modern economic growth. When it kicks in, it can have a dramatic impact very quickly when my production is outpacing my population, which means people generally in your nation are wealthier than they were before. Okay, as a result of modern economic growth, we have huge gaps between some countries, right? So as you can see, the dark bluish purple are advanced economies. Then we have our in transition economies that are kind of kicked into modern economic growth. And then we have our less developed and least developed countries in orange and red that are still waiting to kick into that modern economic growth. So huge disparities around the world. Here we can see the GDP per capita of Qatar is the highest in the world. Why? Because their population is minuscule, right? So they have the most, I'm sorry, they don't have the highest GDP per capita. They have the most growth in GDP per capita. So at 752%. So modern economic growth is through the roof. Luxembourg, you can see here, has the greatest GDP per capita, which means that people are wealthiest in Luxembourg, which is a modern European city state. But it has an astronomically small population. So whatever they make is split between very few people. And notice the United States is all the way down here at 13, not doing bad with 60,000, but our growth rate on that is not nearly as high. Okay, so why is there global disparity in GDP? We talked about modern economic growth, but what kind of causes it? Here are a few things, and these aren't really that important, so I'm just going to cruise through them. If you have a capitalist economic system, capitalism uh, prioritizes growth. And so we focus on economic growth all the time. And that means you're going to see more gains in your economy. Two, we have property rights. When nations have property rights, people invest in their resources. When people invest in their resources, those resources are going to be more productive when businesses buy them to produce goods and services. So if you have your own house, you're going to take much better care of it than if you're over at your friend's house where you might just throw your trash wherever, for example. Capital stock is very high. What's capital stock? It's just the amount of labor assist you have in your nation. So when you have a lot of good capital goods, your population is going to be much more productive, right? And that increases your GDP per capita. Human capital is really important. Do people have access to free and public education in that nation? If they do, that means individuals are going to be more productive than they were before. And then, of course, natural resource endowment. Who has the natural resources? Who has access to those natural resources? If you have very few of them, then normally that's associated with low GDP. So here we go. This is the global economy by GDP. Notice that the United States has about 24% of the entire world's economy through their GDP. Really interesting stuff there. Okay, so there are two approaches to calculating GDP. We'll pick this up in the next video. Those approaches are expenditure and income approach. I'll do those on a much shorter video coming up next. Enjoy. Bye, guys.